You can always tell when the weather begins to get a little nicer in Minnesota. We have been here now 26 years, and every late April, May, I act totally surprised when I see my neighbors for the first time in like 5 months. We're all coming out of hibernation, and each year it surprises me. Oh yeah, I haven't seen you guys for almost half a year. So it feels like weather's better, we're out and about. So welcome to this, our last session of the 25-26, Living the Message. What we've been working on this year is stories that shape us. And this last one is not a single story, but a collection of stories. And for that, I want to thank Katie Stevenson, because I was supposed to do just one story, and I wanted to do the ending of a gospel, and I was trying to zero in on my favorite ending of the gospel, and I couldn't pick a favorite ending of the gospel, so I'm doing all four. In part because I think there's something very similar about the dynamic of those stories, or the way they end or don't end. So the title for this session is Just the Beginning. And what I'm curious about asking is, what do the Gospels want to do to us? Because words don't just say things, words do things. Words have an impact. Words create feelings. And there was a linguistic philosopher from Britain in the middle of the last century by the name of John Austin, who wrote a little book entitled Words Do Things. And his primary argument was, when we think of words with language with speech, we tend to think of language's power as being descriptive. And he said, actually, that's secondary. The primary power of words is emotive, to create a feeling, to have an impact. And then he went further and said, in fact, most times you only know what words mean when you feel what they do to you. And so we could use an example, and he would talk about different kinds of speech acts. When you say, I bet you that Anthony Edwards will have 35 points in the next game, I haven't just described something, I've set something in motion, a bet. And we are now thinking about the future differently because of that bet. When words are said in the context of a particular kind of service or gathering, like I do, as in, will you take this man or woman? You're not simply describing something, you're creating something. And so Austin's argument was really that sometimes you only know what words mean when you feel what they do to you. So if you are talking with a friend in a room, and I know that you would never ever gossip, so you're just sharing some news about a mutual friend, and you say, or let me back up again. Let me just take the simple sentence. The door is open. What does that mean? Well, it depends on what it does to you. It could be that it's drafty in the room, and you're saying the door is open, and you're asking someone to close the door. It could be that you've said it a couple times already, and so you say the door is open. Or, this is what I was thinking of a moment ago, you are there, not gossiping, just sharing news about a mutual friend, and you say the door is open. Each of those means something different. One is inviting action, the other is keep your voice down. The door is open, sort of signaling a warning. And so what I get interested about in the Gospels is to keep that in mind. They're not neutral descriptions. They are active. They are meant to create something, to set something in motion. And so that's kind of what I want to look at. And I think sometimes in stories, it's really, really helpful to pay attention to the beginnings and the endings. Like, those really matter. The one draws us into the story, and the other sends us back out again. So really briefly, in thinking about beginnings, think about how differently the four Gospels begin. In Matthew, you have the genealogy. This is we're coming into the year of Matthew this coming fall and or Advent through next year. We've been doing a gospel a year, and we were looking at the readings for Advent. And the first chapter of Matthew is, now here are the descendants of Jesus. Abraham begat so-and-so, who begat, who begat, who begat. And I was like, well, we clearly can't use that. And one of the pastors who joins me in the planning committee said, I don't know, I think it might be interesting to do a sermon series on the genealogy of Jesus. To protect the innocent, I'm going to not share his name. But his initials are Ben Cieslik. So we're going to do something else. Actually, what I decided was I think it would be interesting to trace out the lineage of Jesus in a series of devotions. But we will do something else on Sunday mornings. But why does Matthew start with the genealogy? Matthew is the most Jewish of the four Gospels that is written to a Jewish audience, trying to convince readers that Jesus is not just the Jewish Messiah, but really the second Moses, the lawgiver and liberator, just like Moses was. And so he starts with a genealogy that traces Jesus back all the way to Abraham, the father of Israel. Interestingly, Luke also offers a genealogy, but not till chapter 3. And Luke, who has a very broad sense of the significance of Jesus, traces Jesus all the way back to Adam, which makes sense because Luke begins his story, the story of Jesus, but then continues it in the Acts of the Apostles. And the Acts of the Apostles are about the spread of the story of Jesus from Jerusalem to the Gentile world through Paul, eventually to Rome and the ends of the earth. And so Luke has this, Matthew's kind of saying, look, this is our guy. He's a descendant of Abraham. Luke is trying to say, this is the Savior of the whole world. And so we'll take him all the way back to Adam. But he only does that in the 3rd chapter. So Matthew has this genealogy. Mark has this sort of brief sentence. It's kind of the shortest introduction possible. Some people think it might even be a title, where Mark writes simply, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, period. That's it. One sentence telling you what's going on, and then jumps immediately to John the Baptist. No birth stories, no angels, no promise making. It is right to John the Baptist, who is the forerunner announcing that the Messiah has come. And that kind of sets the pace for Mark. Mark is like the evening news. It is one story after another after another. One of the most frequently repeated words in Mark is immediately. Immediately just Jesus did this, immediately this, immediately this. So it is just off to the races. Luke begins with a pair of birth announcements in chapters 1 and 2, before then describing the birth of Jesus, genealogy in 3. The first announcement is to Zechariah, who is a priest and who is serving in the temple when he is visited by Gabriel and promised that his barren wife Elizabeth will have John the Baptist. And when you get a priest serving in a temple and a barren wife, you are thinking, this feels like an Old Testament story. And there's a way in which, for Luke, he is bridging. This is the hinge from the Old Testament stories of Israel to the New Testament of Jesus. And so you have a birth promise or announcement to these Old Testament. I mean, they could almost wipe the dust off their clothing. They feel so much like the Old Testament. And then comes Mary, this young maiden, who will then give birth to the Messiah. So there's this kind of hinge movement from Old Testament to the gospel. And then in John, you have in the beginning, hearkening back to Genesis, same words. In the beginning was the Word. And when you think about that choice of description, it's really interesting. We know people best when we hear what they say. We can watch them and have a sense of them, but it's not till you are in relationship, till you're talking, speaking, that you really reveal yourself. And in John, that is who Jesus is, God's Word, the revealer, the one who makes clear who God is. And John takes it all the way back, reclaiming that sense of Genesis, the significance for all of history. So when you look at those beginnings, each of them is different. Each of them orients you to what is to come, tries to set you up to hear the witness that evangelist is going to offer. Now, what I find really interesting when we look at the endings of stories is this kind of, to me, this curiosity. The resurrection is the climax of the story in all the Gospels. There's no question about it. Everything points to cross and resurrection. You can't really separate them, cross and resurrection. But even though, like, this is the whole reason for Christianity, this is the climax of the story, Jesus is raised from the dead, there is no other story in the Gospels that is at once exactly the same and told with more distinctiveness, more differences. If you were to read, and it would take you 6 or 8 minutes, the 4 resurrection stories in whole, one after the other, you would be left like, are you guys really telling the same story? So a couple of for instances. How many women are at the open tomb? Actually, I'll make this a quiz. How many women were at the open tomb? Oh, well, look at that. It depends. Who are you reading? In Mark, there are 3, and they're named. In Matthew, there are 2. In John, there is just 1, Mary Magdalene. Luke names 3, but then talks about the other women. You have 4 different answers. Like, didn't someone take a role? Who really was there? Well, how many angels were there? Again, how many angels were there at the open tomb? 1 or 2. That's a safe answer. Well, in Mark, there was 1 dressed as a man, described as a man dressed in white. In Matthew, there is 1 named as an angel who descends from the heavens and opens the tomb. Like, it's the only story in which when they get there, the stone is not rolled away, and they behold an angel descending from heaven, rolls away the tomb, and then sits on top of it before making a declaration. And this Matthew is the story that has the guards, and the guards faint out of terror. Luke, it's 2 men in dazzling clothes who suddenly appear beside the women. The tomb is open, the women look in, they're wondering, and all of a sudden there are 2 angels around them. So again, 4, like similar, whoops, what happened there? Don't know. Just appeared. So again, kind of similar, but different. Last, for instance, who sees Jesus? In Matthew, it's the 2 women at the tomb, and then the disciples, but in Galilee. Jesus says in Mark and in Matthew, go to the disciples, go to my brothers, tell them that I will meet them in Galilee. So it's kind of back to the beginning where everything started, because that's where Jesus calls them. In Matthew, that plays out as the 2 women at the tomb, and then the disciples, but not till they're in Galilee. In John, it's Mary Magdalene, and then the disciples in the upper room, and then it's Thomas. So there's a series of successive appearances from Jesus. In Luke, it is 2 disciples. There's the empty tomb scene, but nobody has seen Jesus yet. It's the angels that tell the women to go and tell. Then there is the scene of the 2 disciples walking on the road to Emmaus, Cleopas and one unnamed disciple. And Jesus encounters them. They share their sadness. They can't believe he hasn't heard the story. He opens up the scriptures to them. He's going to continue on. They say, stay, it's getting night. The roads aren't safe. Stay with us. They have a meal. He breaks bread. They see that it's Jesus in that moment. It's revealed. And then they return to Jerusalem saying, were not our hearts burning when he opened to us? So there's Emmaus. And then the rest of the disciples. They come back. They share the story. And then Jesus appears with them. And the first thing they do when Jesus appears is not say, just like you promised, or praise God. They say, would you like a little supper? Actually, they don't quite say that. They're too afraid to say anything. They think he's a ghost. So Jesus says, why don't you serve me some fish? And I will show you a ghost does not eat. And I'm going to eat. And then in Mark, the really, 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 really scandalous ending, and we'll get back to that more. Who sees Jesus? No one. No one at all. Jesus does not show up in the original oldest ending of Mark, and we'll talk about that a little later. So I've always just found that as really, really interesting. I mean, this is the climax of the story. If you want to get one thing right, It is like, did the Spurs sink the three-pointer with half a second left or not? They did not. He missed. 104, 102. Yes, stayed up to midnight to watch that. Like you'd think you'd get that right. And this is the one story that's repeated all four times, that there is more difference in the way to tell the stories than almost anything else, which I just find fascinating. All right, so here's what I want to do a little bit. I want to start a little bit and remind you of things that you probably learned in English class or composition class or literature class at some point. And that are kind of the 6 component parts of a story. And it's, beginning, middle, and end. And these theories of literature go all the way back to Aristotle. And each of them has 2 points. So the beginning is an exposition or a starting point, gets something that gets things going. And then there's a problem. There's some kind of, it says conflict in some ways, it just needs to be a problem, like something goes wrong. You and I would never pay good money to go see a movie about 2 police officers that get on a bus and take the bus into work. But if those 2 police officers get on a bus and the bus goes above 50 miles an hour, and then they discover that if the bus goes under 50 miles an hour, it's going to explode, and it's starring Keanu Reeves, you might go. That was the movie Speed. But think about it. Every movie that you watch, something goes wrong. Because if we have like a good day where everything kind of goes the way we're hoping, there's nothing surprising, nothing difficult, nothing dangerous, nobody wants to watch that movie. Nobody wants to read that story. Stories are set in motion by something going wrong. Then the middle part of the story is what's called rising action. Usually that means things get worse before they get better. The tension gets greater. The problem gets deeper. The complexities that the characters are facing grow even more complex. All of that. And then there is this climax. Something comes to a head. And then the last part of the story is after that climax, there's what's called the denouement, or the falling action. Things begin to resolve, things settle back into a new equilibrium. That's easy for you to say. You have a sense of where the characters are going, and then there's this sense of resolution, where things are like, oh, okay, that is satisfying. We're back to a status of that equilibrium again. What I think is kind of interesting to me then is when you look at the Gospels, the conclusion in this sense, that third part of the story of each Gospel is also a little bit different, both from each other, but also from this standard pattern. So we'll take Matthew's first. This is from the end of Matthew 28. Now the 11 disciples, and just a quick reminder, so Matthew is the one where the women come to the tomb, the rock is still there, the angel descends, there are guards placed at the tomb, they faint for fear. Jesus says, go and tell my brothers, I will meet them ahead in Galilee. First the angels tell them that, then Jesus tells them that. And then there's this interesting scene where the guards go back and they tell what they've seen, and they say, don't tell anyone. We're going to tell them that they robbed the body, that someone stole the body. And that is likely dealing with some of the rumors that were circulating in Matthew's community. So he deals with that, and then it comes to this. Now, the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had directed them. Remember earlier I mentioned Matthew's interest is sharing the way in which Jesus is the new Moses. Well, then he's going to end up back at a mountain. He has the Sermon on the Mount, is Jesus' biggest sermon in Matthew, like Moses is on the mountain and returns to a mountain. To the mountain to which Jesus directed them, and when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. That little sentence might be the one thing that most clearly ties all 4 gospel accounts of the resurrection together. In every single one, the disciples doubt or are afraid or do not believe. And it really is, given that Jesus doesn't even appear in all 4 accounts, it might be the one striking feature that is common through all 4, which again, I just find it really fascinating because think about it, these are the disciples. These are the people who worked with Jesus the most, traveled with him the longest, heard him teach most frequently, knew his plans, had spent all this time with him, were close friends. None of them greet the risen Lord with thanksgiving or praise or reassurance. Every single account describes these moments of doubt or fear or worry, which I just think is really, really fascinating. It might be that if you believe these stories too quickly, maybe we're not taking them as seriously as we should. Okay, Jesus, when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." All right, let's move on to to St. Luke. St. Luke, again, is the one where after the women leave the tomb, there's the scene from Emmaus, and then Jesus meets the disciples. They are, again, afraid. Jesus offers to eat some fish to reassure them. And then he said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written, that the Messiah is to suffer and to rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem." Remember when I mentioned Matthew's genealogy goes all the way back? Luke's goes all the way back to Adam. This is why it's all the nations, not just Israel, beginning at Jerusalem. "You are witnesses of these things, and see, I am sending upon you what my Father promised. So stay here in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high." Then he led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them, and while he was blessing them, he withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven, and they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they were continually in the temple blessing God. Now, what I find really interesting is Jesus' last words to them. "You are witnesses to these things. See, I'm sending upon you. So stay here. Wait. Wait here." There is not a kind of resolution. This is the close of part one. Does anyone remember the first time they saw Star Wars? I remember it vividly because it was, I don't know how, I was little. I was young. My two brothers and my dad and I were supposed to spend the day in Hershey Park, which was a big amusement park in Pennsylvania. And when we got up, the weather forecast said it was going to be stormy all day. And so we decided not to go to Hershey Park. Instead, we decided to go to a movie. And I don't know how many of you remember, but the trailer for Star Wars was terrible. Like, it was considered one of the worst previews ever made. But it was like the only thing showing that we could get seats for. So we went in, we got in late, and it just blew us away. Like, if you remember this is a big aside. Sorry. But the science fiction movie before Star Wars was called Logan's Run with Michael York. And it was like every other film was fine until you saw. That's okay. Until you saw Star Wars, and it was this quantum leap in special effects. Like, it was, you could not imagine it. And so we were so bummed we weren't going to the amusement park. And instead we went to this movie, and we got in a little late. We watched it all the way through, and we just stayed to watch it all through one more time because we were just so blown away. And like, not the very, very end of the movie, but the end of the climax when they finally blow up the Death Star. Oh, sorry, spoiler alert. And remember, like, Darth Vader is chasing Luke, and then he drops it in, and it blows up, and then Darth Vader's like little thing is like spinning away, and then it stops, and he kind of flies off. And you all know, like, ooh, this story isn't done yet. Right? There's more coming to this story. Like, it didn't say to be continued, but it should have said to be continued. This is what Luke is doing, right? You are witnesses of these things, and I am about to send the Holy Spirit upon you. So don't go anywhere. Like, wait right there. This is Luke saying, to be continued, which is why then we have the end of Luke also serves as the beginning of Acts, the end of Luke part 2, which is really Acts chapter 1. Now, while staying with them, Luke goes back, overlaps. He ordered them not to leave Jerusalem. That's the continuity, but to wait there for the promise of the Father. This, he said, is what you've heard from me. And then this sets up the giving of the Holy Spirit. It sets up the Pentecost. And then John closes with the story of Thomas. Remember, John is Mary Magdalene. And then it's that evening, the 11 disciples in the upper room with the doors locked. And then Thomas isn't there, but a week later, Thomas is there. And at the end of that encounter, a week later, his disciples were in the house. Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand, put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are all those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." And what I think is really interesting about that story is that my sense of John is he shares a number of encounters that Jesus has with other people. From Nicodemus in chapter 3, and the woman in the well in chapter 4, and the man born blind in chapter 10, and Pilate in chapter 8. Like again and again, he encounters people, and they all have a different response. Nicodemus is kind of confused and mystified, not sure what to make of things. The woman at the well is first like nervous and then excited and goes and tells people. The man born blind is kicked out of the synagogue, but glad to find Jesus. Pilate wants to wash his hands of everything and keep distance. There's all these possible options. And I think part of what Jesus is doing is little by little revealing who he is through all the I am and talking about himself, but then also offering different options. This is the last encounter in John's gospel with Thomas. And Thomas also doubts, comes with, "I will not believe unless I can put my hand on the mark." Jesus offers, he doesn't need it anymore, and then he makes the greatest confession, not only of John's gospel, but all 4 gospels, calling Jesus my Lord. Kurios is the Greek word, and it is the word applied to Caesar. So, my Lord and my God, confessing that Jesus is God. The only other place anyone gets close to saying that in the Gospels, interestingly, is the very beginning of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So there's this kind of climax moment. And I think John's intent, we talked about words doing things, I think his hope is that now that we've read through all these encounters, we've learned all these things about Jesus, all the ways in which Jesus, I am, all the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy, that we then will get to this part and say, "Oh my word, me too, my Lord and my God." We will confess like Thomas does. And then, because again, I think John is writing for an impact. Then it goes on. I shared this in a sermon a couple weeks ago. Blessed are, do you believe because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen me, have come to believe. As I said before, I always thought that Jesus at this point was kind of scolding Thomas. I mean, it feels like that, rebuking him for his lack of faith. And I always felt bad for Thomas. I mean, he just made the biggest confession in the Gospels. And all he gets is like a slap on the wrist. Until I thought, well, maybe, maybe this isn't for Thomas. Maybe John is writing this for us. And so then I imagine it as like if we were sort of portraying it in a film, Jesus is kind of having this encounter with Thomas, but then all of a sudden as he says those words, he just looks out and beyond Thomas, and it's addressed to the readers. John's readers who never got to see Jesus, who have the same challenges and struggles, and John's readers ever since, which includes us. That's what John is doing. And then the conclusion to John is really John kind of revealing his hand. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, that through believing you may have life in his name. John comes clean. I am after your faith. By the time you're done this, I hope you're ready to make Thomas's confession. Right? That's like a mic drop ending, conclusion. But wait, the gospel we have doesn't end with chapter 20. There's another chapter. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. I thought if you happened to be at the Minneapolis campus on Sunday, I thought Pastor Dixon preached one of his best sermons yet. And I loved the way he began. Chapter 21 is John's Minnesota goodbye. So I listened to it the first service, and then in the second service, when it came to that part again, I was in the sacristy and I had my computer, and so I started thinking, like, is that, like, we all know what a Minnesota goodbye is. Is that a thing? Like, you know how everyone, like, the Irish goodbye is a thing. You know, it's when you don't tell the host. You just sneak out and make a quiet exit, and that's the Irish. And so I just Googled it, the Minnesota goodbye. It is a thing. Like, it's not just here. Like, Google just starts spouting up. Yes, the Minnesota goodbye is when it takes a long time to say between Scandinavian and Midwestern hospitality, and it takes a long time to leave, and then it broke it down into its constituent parts. Like, it laid it out. Like, first comes the declaration of departure. and it gave examples. We really should start be going now, or it's past our bedtime. Like, all those different, several possibilities of how you start your exit. And then it was like the deferral of the departure. And it was like, really, you should have more food. Or why didn't you stay for longer? You just got here. Why are you leaving? All of those. And then, like, it went through like 4 parts. And then it was also like the walk together to the car. And then it was like, by the car conversation. And it said, and then finally the host bids you goodbye and offers a few more words with the window rolled down. And then it added, even in very cold weather. And then, so I know this is another diverse aside. And then it said possible topics of conversation, which are also obvious to us. But I'm just picturing someone from Manhattan, which is like, just do this. Reading this, like, what would I talk about? Well, what are they? The weather, It was sports, and then this is the funniest one: sump pumps. And every single one of us at one time or another has been like, "How's your sump pump?" It was a riot. Anyway, I just thought that was brilliant. I told him later that was such a good opening that I am for sure stealing it. I can't wait to do it, like, on the East Coast or on the West Coast. Well, we're in Minnesota. Anyway. But I thought it was such an apropos, like, description of this chapter 21. And we'll get to this in a bit. Unlike in Mark, where in Mark, like, you will remember that we have no original copy of a gospel. We have, like, copies of copies of copies, but nothing from the 1st century, 2nd century. The earliest fragments are from, like, mid-2nd century. The first complete manuscript of any gospel is from the Middle Ages. Like, that is 900, 1,000 in those years. So what scholars have done over the years is taken the different fragments that have been found in different places and kind of pieced them together. And we feel like we have a pretty accurate but no original version of the Gospels. And what's interesting is that sometimes there are whole manuscript, like, you can date, this is an older manuscript than this one. And the oldest manuscripts of Mark, and we'll get back to this in a minute or two, end with and the women left the tomb and with fear and amazement, and so said nothing to anyone. Like, that is the earliest. Then it's like a couple centuries later, there are manuscripts that then have another ending, and we'll look at that. That's not the case in John. And in John, the earliest manuscript we have has chapter 20 and chapter 21. Which, again, is one of those, for me, it puzzles me. Because chapter 20, it is such an ending. Like, now Jesus and many other things, these are written so that you believing have life in his name. Boom, done. And so the Minnesota goodbye is just so perplexing of why John does that. But the earliest copies we have. So I have no idea if in John's community, before it was distributed or was sent out, someone added that. But it's just so interesting, this whole other ending. And what happens there is, after these things, Jesus showed himself, it happened in this way. Then we have the whole scene of the miraculous catch of fish, which in some of the other some of the other gospels is at the very beginning, and it's the scene that prompts the calling of the disciples. In this case, though, John puts it at the very end, and then makes breakfast for the disciples on the beach, calls Peter to himself afterward, and they have this conversation. Do you love me? You know that I love you. Feed my sheep. And then at the close of that, then John writes, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, you'll remember this is the major character in the second half of John's gospel. A lot of biblical scholars think this might have been the founder of the community for whom this gospel was written. He's likely a disciple of Jesus, but not one of the top 12, the well-known one. And I've always thought the writer of this gospel kind of wants to kind of lift him up a little and say, hey, our guy was pretty special too. And so at different moments, you'll have a kind of a comparison of Peter and the beloved disciple. And it's not much of a competition because one of them is named Peter and the other is named the disciple Jesus loved. Who's going to win? But you'll remember it is on the Easter, they both run to the tomb. The beloved disciple gets there first because he's the better athlete. He waits for Peter. Peter barges in. They come out. Peter's kind of confused. The beloved disciple believes. There's just these moments like this. This is another one. In the recommissioning of Peter scene, they're out fishing. The beloved disciple is the one who says, it's the Lord. Whereas Peter says, I better get dressed because he doesn't have anything on. So he puts his clothes on, jumps. So all that stuff. Now, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that's going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? And Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. So the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. But if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true. But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose the whole world itself could not contain the books that would be written. There's kind of an awkwardness to this. It feels like a kind of tying up of loose ends. When I mentioned that Matthew shares the story of guards at the tomb and then don't tell anyone, tell them they stole the body, that Matthew was likely addressing a rumor that was in the community. And kind of putting that rumor to bed. This has sort of a similar feel, that the founder of this community, the beloved disciple, that people must have thought well, Jesus said he's not going to die, and maybe they're disappointed because he does die, and it creates doubt. And so there's a story here to help make sense of that. Yeah, Jesus said, if it is my will, well, then he must, but that's not what Jesus said, if it is my will, not he would live forever. And so kind of addresses that relationship between Peter and the beloved disciple. And then the affirmation, this is the disciple testifying. So there's this kind of peculiar second ending that, again, it feels like it's trying to tie up some loose ends. And then finally, Mark, the one that I've always found really, really interesting. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And it's that last line that is kind of startling. because there's really clear direction here. They're going to the empty tomb. There's an angel who greets them, or two men or a young man dressed in a white robe. Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus crucified. He's been raised. Like the best news they could have imagined. He has been raised. He is not here. He is going ahead of you. And then go and tell the disciples and Peter. And I love that inclusion of Peter. In the same way that John has the story of Jesus asking Peter 3 times, do you love me? And Peter gets to answer 3 times, yes, I do, making up for the 3 times he denied his Lord. Like there's this recommissioning. I think this is Mark's way of doing that too. Go tell the disciples and Peter, the one who needs it the most. The one who has least reason to imagine that I would send a personal note to him after the last time he just denied me. So there's this kind of, I think, momentary poignancy there. Go tell the disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of Galilee. There you will see him just like he promised. This kind of reassurance of promise. And so they went out and fled from the tomb. That's the first discordant note. Fled. Okay, ran. For terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The story ends in failure. It is just absolutely kind of disturbing. And for that reason, later manuscripts of Mark, like centuries later, someone, I'm guessing it was a monk whose job was to copy the scriptures down because there were no printing presses, read that and thought what I did. That can't be right. And then he had this other idea. I can fix that. And so you get the shorter ending of Mark. And all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterwards, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. That is the resolution we were looking for. What's interesting is just reading that sentence or two, nothing in that sentence. There are several things that sound familiar, like, okay, went to tell them and those around Peter. Afterwards, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west. That feels a little bit like the Great Commission in Matthew. And then the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. There are like 3 or 4 words in that sentence that Mark doesn't use anywhere else in the whole gospel. Like it just doesn't feel or sound like Mark because it's not. It's an anxious monk. And then, like even later, there's what's called a longer ending of Mark. And this is so long, I didn't want to put it all in here. And that one just gets weird because that's the one where it says, and he gave them power to handle poisonous snakes, and so that even if they were bitten, they wouldn't die. So if you ever wonder where the sort of, I don't know, bayou, I associate with the bayou, I have no idea, charismatic snake handling of revivalist Christians, if you've ever seen movies or like that's where. And it just gets so odd, like it gets more and more fantastical. But let's go back to the way it actually ends. That was disturbing enough that people felt like they better finish the story for Mark in a better way. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So I was always like, again, found this odd, alarming, striking, peculiar, like it's the kind of ending that won't let you go. And part of it is like, not only do you have the good news, Jesus has been raised, he is not here. There's very clear instructions, go and tell. And then what struck me, and actually this was not my insight, I do not remember who I learned it from. I just know I never would have thought of this on my own. But there is this interesting pattern that runs across Mark's gospel, which is that the people who should know who Jesus is don't always tell, or they don't always recognize Jesus. And the people who do recognize who Jesus is, you can't count on for a testimony. And so like a couple quick examples. In the 5th chapter of Mark, he is in the land of the Gerasenes, so a foreign land, and it's when The young man is possessed, and Jesus comes, and the demons recognize Jesus. Like the demons speaking out of, this is like exorcist imagery, speaking out of the man, the possessed man, say, Jesus, Son of the Almighty, what do you have to do with us? Like the demon recognizes who Jesus is. But here's the thing. Can you count on a demon for a testimony? No, you cannot. The other scene where someone that is a little surprising absolutely recognizes Jesus is at the foot of the cross. As Jesus is dying, the Roman centurion who just put him to death says, truly, this man was the Son of God. Like, he gets it. But can you count on a Roman centurion for a testimony? No, you cannot. The disciples regularly are with Jesus and do not know what to say. This is more true in Mark's gospel than anywhere else. I mean, Jesus predicts his death and resurrection 3 different times. And it's kind of like he has to do it 3 times because they're not paying attention. One of them, he is saying to them, we're going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be handed over. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to die. On the 3rd day, we're going to rise again. And the disciples answer by saying, Lord, who's the greatest among us? It's like right over. It's like Jesus saying, just so you know, it's going to get bad. I'm going to die, but then I'll rise again. And the disciples answer, like they're borderline idiots in Mark's gospel. And the reason we think he portrayed them as so clueless was that he was writing to a community that after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Temple of Jerusalem and Rome began to persecute Jews and Christians. This is the theory, many in Mark's community were terrified and assimilated back into their regular life. And little by little, the church is coming back together. And Mark wants to make sure that the people coming together know the disciples know better than they were. You know, this is the one where Peter denies Jesus 3 times. The disciples fall asleep 3 times in the Garden of Gethsemane. Like over and over, he's like, look, do you notice these guys that are the disciples and how many times they messed up? You will be just fine. Like, come on back to the family. Luke, on the other hand, is writing a part 2. And in part 2, those same disciples lead the proclamation of the gospel to the whole world. So Luke softens his story of the disciples. They only fall asleep once. And then Luke gives them a reason for grief. They were so upset, they took a nap. Because I think Luke is reading Mark. I mean, Luke writes later. He has Mark in front of him. He's reading Mark, and he's thinking, nobody's going to believe these guys went on to take the gospel to the whole world. Like, I need to clean them up a little. And so that's kind of this, but in Mark, that's a real pattern. The people who should know don't, and the people who do know, you can't count on telling. So in that sense, it shouldn't surprise us at all that the women, like all the other disciples, fail. They don't tell. And then what gets really interesting about that, and this is the insight that I remember reading from someone years ago, and it just was like, what was really interesting about this is that means that at this point in the story, there's only one person left in the whole universe who knows who Jesus is and what has happened, that he's been raised from the dead. And you know who that is? It is the person reading. It's you. Like Mark I always thought like, okay, Mark tells a really crisp story. He just stinks at endings. And then I was like, oh my word, no, Mark is brilliant at endings because you've been reading the story. You're invested. It's moving right along. You know these characters. You know the story. At the end, everyone fails, and it hits you exactly what I mentioned before. This can't, I don't know where it was. Yeah, this can't be right. And then Mark's hope for impact is, I better go and tell. Like the word is not, I need to tell someone. This is amazing. and everyone else is quiet. It's my job to go and tell. And so Mark is creating this kind of narrative burden or urgency. It's not an invitation. It is like, you have got to tell. And it works. I mean, something about this works. Mark's the earliest story because, in fact, someone told, or we wouldn't have these stories. So Mark kind of creates that tension. I was like, then when I was reading that insight, and I was just like, oh my goodness, Mark is way better at endings than I thought. Then I thought, well, I've always been kind of hard on him for his beginning. Remember before I just said he has like the lamest, shortest, boringest intro ever? This is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Like, seriously, Mark? Like, think how that compares to Matthew's long genealogy, or Luke's beautiful story of the angels and Mary, or John's poetic, in the beginning was the Word. This is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Like, boom, nothing. But then I thought, wait. If Mark's really good at endings, and I didn't get it, maybe he's really good at beginnings, and I didn't get that either. And then what struck me was like, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Maybe Mark's not talking about chapter 1, verse 1. Like, here, this is the beginning of the story I'm going to tell you. Maybe Mark is talking about all 16 chapters. Like, this whole story is just the beginning. Like, Mark, from the beginning of the story, says, I'm going to tell you this amazing story. You know what's most amazing? It is just getting started. Like, you now get to be in it. You get to be a character. You get to tell. In fact, it's imperative that you carry on this story. And so it's striking to me when you think about the Gospel's endings, all four of them, in relation to kind of literary story, what we expect. The endings of the Gospel don't offer a clear resolution. There's not like a neat tidying everything up and saying, okay, it's done. But instead, they do two things. One, they move us forward. So you have in the end of Matthew, the Great Commission, the marching orders, send us out to share, go and tell, baptize all the nations. In Luke, it is like, hey, to be continued, more is coming. The Holy Spirit is going to capture you and will lead you out in the world. John ends with a sense of purpose. I'm going to stick with chapter 20 as the original ending. The sense of like, do you believe now? Do you get it like Thomas? Go and confess, my Lord and my God. And then wraps up some loose ends. So one, it moves us forward. And then two, it also, and I think this is what's interesting too, and this goes back to Austin, different kinds of speech acts. One of the most powerful speech acts in the world, Austin would always say, is the speech act of promise, making promises. Because promises shape your expectations about the future and lead you to live differently in anticipation of the future. Like I remember this vividly when my kids were little. If I said, like, as soon as you're home from school and the chores are done, we're going to go out and play with the dogs or whatever. We're going to go see a movie. When I got home, guess what? The chores were done. There was this promise, and the expectation of that shaped the way they looked at the future and the way they acted in the present to live into that future. So they move us forward and they make us a promise. Now think about the promises in Matthew. After the Great Commission comes what I think is the great promise. And I will be with you always, even to the close of the age. In Mark, it is the drive. You need to go tell. You can go tell. And as you are hearing that, you're remembering that the angel said to the women, Jesus will go ahead of you to Galilee, just like he promised. That's what gives you not only I need to tell, but as I do, I will be met by Jesus. In Luke, you too will see Jesus in the opening of scriptures and the breaking of the bread. Let me go back. This is a reference to the Emmaus story. Remember, only Luke has the Emmaus story. And if you were to take that story out of Luke and just go from the empty tomb scene to the disciples, Jesus appearing to the disciples scene, it would be seamless. Like you wouldn't even notice. Luke is clearly has a tradition, and he puts this big story in the middle of it. And that story, again, is two disciples on the way to Emmaus. They don't recognize who Jesus is. He opens up the scriptures, and then he joins them for a meal, and then it says, and he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to them. And they realized it was Jesus. That language in English and in Greek is identical to Jesus' words, to Luke's description of the Last Supper. He took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave to them. Except this time, in that moment, Jesus is revealed to them. And so when I think about why would Luke put that story in, which is always our question, not which one was right, but what are they trying to tell us? I think Luke is kind of doing what John's doing. Remember when John has Jesus bless all those people who haven't seen him but believe, blessing his community? I think Luke is doing something very similar here, saying, you didn't get to see Jesus either, I know that, but do you know where you will see him? Well, where do we meet regularly? And Jesus, the scriptures are opened and we share a meal. Church. Get to church. There's where you'll see Jesus. That's Luke's promise. And then John, blessed are those who believe without seeing. That is us. Which is why I think with the Gospels, the end is always just the beginning in all four accounts. And what I would close with is this thought, that that's not just the Gospels, but it's the people and the community and the worship around the Gospels too. So when we say that, which is why with the Gospels, the end is just the beginning, that is kind of like church today. What do we close with? We close with ascending. You've heard the word. Now go. We say the Lord's Prayer. More recently, we've added the prayer of good courage. And then it is the benediction sent back out in the world. Church is not an escape. It is not a refuge. We may at times breathe more calmly. We may find a sense of peace and security at church, and I would never undervalue that. But at the end of the day, we can't stay there. We're invited back out again into the world, knowing that God goes with us. The end is just the beginning. All right. It's been a fun year. It's been fun to share this with my colleagues. It's been fun to share some stories with you. Before we go, I do want a little bit of a reveal, and that is the theme for the 26-27, Living the Message. What would Jesus do? Anyone remember the bracelets and all the language? All right, so, but we're gonna have a little bit twist, and I couldn't find a visual yet, so we'll make one up by next fall. What would Jesus do? Or I think the more interesting question, or the way to answer that, is to ask, what did Jesus do? And so we're going to share this across the pastoral staff again, and we're each going to choose stories from the Gospels that we feel illustrate what Jesus came to do and did, that then help us think about what Jesus would have us do and how we might live in the world. There is a lot of talk about Jesus these days, and some of it I recognize as biblical. I'm not, and a lot of it I don't. And I think this is a chance for your pastoral staff to say, here is the heart of what we confess, who we confess Jesus is. And we know that by looking at what he did. And that then shapes how we can respond, how we might be, what we imagine Jesus would do in the world today. All right, Katie, any final words of benediction?
I thank you, Pastor Lois, for your teaching. It's been a wonderful year. The same pastors are teaching next year. Pastor Lois will teach 2 or 3 times. I am so privileged and such a joy to be part of this community of Mount Olivet, the learning that happens here. I hope you enjoyed the year.
And nothing happens without Katie Stevenson. Let's